Hello, and welcome to Literary Notes, a podcast by the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library. I'm your producer, Nathan Ureta. If you've ever been to the Museum of Pop Culture, formerly the Experience Music Project in Seattle, you're probably familiar with their huge collection of music artifacts. Kurt Cobain's Stratocaster, album notes handwritten by Tupac, bell-bottoms worn by Jimi Hendrix at Woodstock. The procurement of these items was first spearheaded by historian Peter Blecha. Getting his start by playing in bands and working in record stores across the Puget Sound, Blecha later found himself as the senior curator for the museum. He writes about this process in his book, Rock and Roll Archaeologist. He came by our studios to talk about this book, as well as Stomp and Shout, R&B, and the Origins of Northwest Rock and Roll, another book we're working on. Thanks to a communication snafu, I ended up filling in for our interviewer at the very last minute. Here's our conversation. Today we have Peter Blecha in the studio. He has written a few books, quite a few actually, but two that are currently in process in our catalog. We have Rock and Roll Archaeologist and Stomp and Shout, and I'm forgetting the subtitle on the second one.
It's Stomp and Shout, R&B, and the it's called Stomp and Shout, R&B, and the Origins of Northwest Rock and Roll.
All right, Peter Blecha, thank you so much for coming down to the studio today.
I'm happy to be here.
So just kind of during our sound check, you were talking about how you were born and raised here in the Pacific Northwest, and then, you know, obviously huge music background. I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about your story and how it relates to, you know, the music scene here in the Pacific Northwest.
I'll give it a try.
Okay.
Yes, I was born here in Seattle and initially raised on Beacon Hill, and loved everything about Seattle even as a kid. You know, we did all the things back then, the Seafair Parade and Woodland Park Zoo, and I especially liked going down to Pike Place Market and First Avenue a lot. My dad used to take me down there back when First Avenue was rough, and, you know, we would walk down the sidewalk and I would look in at all the rough taverns and I didn't know what those strip clubs or anything else that was going on, but it was a lot different than it is now. It was a lot of sailors on the streets, and a lot of Native Americans still were in town. And it was just an exciting place to have my early childhood. We then later moved to Olympia, and that was where I first got really excited about music, I guess, because I'm one of those Beatlemaniac kids that in 1964 discovered the Beatles and decided that I liked rock and roll a lot. Initially decided that I wanted to be a drummer, but the parents unfortunately talked to some people who said no matter what instrument a kid's going to learn, they probably should start on piano. And by golly, we happened to have a piano already in the living room. So I got stuck taking some piano lessons. And from there, eventually, about 2 years later, I guess in fifth grade, when you're allowed to join the school orchestra, I took up snare drum and played in the school orchestra, and all the way through junior high and into high school, and played in the pep band and the jazz band, I guess, and everything I could. The marching band did all that whole thing. But in the meantime, I did start meeting other guys who wanted to play in rock bands, and so I think in 1971 I helped form my first rock band, which was called Warbucks, and we thought we were a revolution rock band. And then went on to form. No, the first band was actually Godmother, and we played hard rock, Hendrix and Led Zeppelin and Rolling Stones and things like that. And then came Warbucks, and then finally my last band was a pure metal band called Valhalla. And but in 1974, graduated from high school and moved back to Seattle and started attending University of Washington, and fell into the scene that was in the U District at that time, which was the beginnings of the punk rock scene, and met all sorts of people who were movers and shakers in the early punk rock scene. And from then I played in many other kinds of bands, country rock and everything that happened in the 80s and into the 90s.
You said you were kind of in this scene that sort of was the beginning of punk rock. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, because I feel like Washington has almost like a secret history with punk rock. Could you just tell me a little bit more about the U District scene?
Sure. When I arrived in September of '74 in the U District, I immediately realized that there were a lot of record stores, a lot of them, and many of them were used record stores, and I had never heard of a used record store before,
Hmm.
and sort of fell in with all the kids that were, working there and the customers, and lo and behold, a lot of the customers were young, striving musicians who would go on to form some of the earliest uh, punk and proto-punk bands, I guess, and early new wave bands, and um, the scene kind of revolved around the record store culture, that all of us were buying records and eventually, culling our collections a little bit and selling some records at those stores and meeting people, and a whole bunch of bands formed just out of that uh, nucleus, I guess, of music addicts at the time, and a lot of those kids, they were. I wasn't into skateboarding, but it then sort of broadened out into the skateboard culture, and by the mid late '70s, some of the early punk bands of note started coming out from New York and things
Right.
like that. New York Dolls came out in 1974, touring this coast,
Hmm.
and a couple more years after that, the Ramones came out and really started changing everybody's way of thinking, I think, and it was all really exciting. It
Hmm.
was a new music and new fashions, and I eventually, meaning in 1976, I got a job. Boy, back in the old days when you could just walk into a record store or something like that, which is what I did, walked into Budget Tapes and Records in the University District and said, "Is there any chance you guys are hiring?" And they said, "Yes, young man, we are. Do you know anything about music?" And I said, "I know everything about music," which I didn't, but I started learning everything about it by working in a record store, and I went on to work several other stores over the years. I worked in used and new record stores from 1976 on and off, up through 1993.
Oh, okay.
I did other things along the way too. I was an Amtrak porter on the train, and I uh, uh, did some gardening and things like that. So, but the record store thing was important in my life for getting exposure to new records as they came out, brand new releases.
Hmm.
Uh, I remember the day that the record distributor guy came in from, I guess, Warner Brothers Records, and they used to come in and give the employees at record stores promo copies, free copies of new albums. And, he came in and I got a promo copy of the Sex Pistols' first album, very important British punk rock, sort of one of those albums that just changed everything for a lot of people. But, everything, the Police first album, and Dire Straits' first album, and the B-52's first album, and Joe Jackson, on and on and on. Um, so it was beyond educational, and got to meet a lot of musicians at that point. People from band members from up and coming bands like Heart,
Hmm.
and a couple other bands from Seattle, Bighorn and Gabriel, also had major label record contracts, and I was meeting those musicians who would come in and buy records, and so it was just a great grounding in music in general, but also I was basically on the front lines of seeing the top current bands of the era
Yeah.
and meeting those guys. And at that point, I made some fake ID so I could start. I was 19 or 20. I guess I was 20 maybe when I finally said, I'm missing out on all these shows in the tavern. So I made some
Hmm.
fake ID, and then I started being able to get into all the taverns and nightclubs and seeing these bands. And
Yeah.
so that was another big step forward.
That's awesome. So you say it was a very educational time working in those record stores. Are there, just out of curiosity, are there any blind spots that you realized you had while working at these record stores? And were those like rabbit holes that you started to dive in? Like any particular ones you can think of?
Yes, two artists that I basically missed out on at
Hmm.
the time. You can't know everything, you can't be exposed to everything,
Sure.
but I'm still irked at myself for not having had the friends who would have educated me about the Velvet Underground.
Oh, okay.
New
Yeah.
York, art rock band.
Hmm.
Um, and the real killer is that I just never heard Iggy Pop and the Stooges
Hmm.
in those years. I think they put their first album out in 1969, and I didn't hear about them until 1978 or something like that. So, uh, and back in those days, I loved Led Zeppelin and I loved Black Sabbath. So I like really heavy music, but but I missed out on the Stooges. And when I listen to their records now, for the last 30 years that I have listened to them, I just think their first couple albums um, are up there with the best rock and rollers. And the other band I missed out on was AC/DC.
Wow.
I
Okay.
was judging the book by the cover,
Sure.
or the album by the cover, and I just thought these guys look weird.
Right. Like
And
the schoolboy
yeah,
uniform and
and the
yeah. Hmm.
devil's horns on his head and all that
Right.
stuff. And I
Yeah.
thought, I'm
Yeah.
not into this satanic malarkey,
Right.
in rock and roll. And lo and behold, there too, realized later, no, you could ignore the cover, and the music is as good as anything I've ever heard. So
Yeah, totally. I mean, I just feel like I could talk about this all day, but let's talk about the books a little bit. So Rock and Roll Archaeologist, the back of this calls you the Indiana Jones of rock and roll. And it's because working at the Experience Music Project, now Mopop, you were the senior curator there. Can you tell me a little bit about what that work was like?
yes, well, that was probably the great job of my whole career, my whole
Mm,
working career and my life. It was just the funnest job. It encompassed music and history, my two main interests.
yeah.
And initially, when I got hired in October of 1992, and I overlapped that job with the last months of my record store job
Mm,
because I wasn't quite ready to leave the record store, not knowing if this museum job
sure.
was going to last, but in fact it did. And initially, it was the task was to locate, find, and acquire Jimi Hendrix related artifacts because the Experience Music Project, which was the early name for Seattle's Music Museum, as you mentioned, which is now the Museum of Pop Culture, or
Right.
MoPop.
Yeah.
Initially, it was going to be a Jimi Hendrix exclusive museum, and so that was the first task for the first, year and a half or two, maybe, was go and find Hendrix related artifacts because we're going to have this museum, we're going to have galleries, we need cool stuff to show, we need good stories to tell about Hendrix and his music and his life. And so that was fun. So I was already at that point doing a lot of traveling around the United States and eventually to Europe and other places, reeling in these artifacts. So that was really fun. Meeting all the top collectors in the world of Jimi Hendrix records and posters and photographs and film, and so that was quite the thrill because I was a huge Hendrix fan. That's how I got hired. I was
Hmm.
at the time, I think, considered the most knowledgeable person in Seattle on the topic of Jimi Hendrix and his life and music. And but then the concept for the museum expanded, and it turned into Jimmy's going to be at the center of this museum, but we want to tell other stories. And through many, many meetings of many, many committees on this team of museum developers, we expanded the concept to we're also going to tell the story of the history of guitars
Hmm.
from ancient times through electric guitars. So I was put in charge of that too. That was another fun thing. I liked antique guitars and I liked guitars in general. And so I was tasked with building a world-class collection of vintage guitars. And so that involved a lot of travel too. And then the third component that I was involved in was telling the story in the museum of Pacific Northwest music history. So that really broadened the task. Now it's
Right.
collect photographs, records, stage apparel
Mm,
that will tell the story from the beginning, which is I researched it and determined that the very first record ever made in Seattle was in 1923, and it was a hotel dance band,
hmm.
dance orchestra back in those days. And it's the record. They cut a record for one of the major labels, Brunswick Records, out of New York, and it was a snappy little thing called "Shake It and Break It."
Ooh, okay.
Yeah, so the title alone had some impact.
Yeah.
Another cool thing that we did was we determined that for this museum, when it opened, we wanted to have uh, TV screens basically in the galleries where people could watch little films. So we had a film production crew making little films
Oh, okay.
about these topics, about Jimi Hendrix and about the history of electric guitars and about Pacific Northwest music history and other things. And so it came about then that we established a video crew that luckily I got to lead a lot of those expeditions out into the world, into England and all over the United States, and dragging along 2 or 3 cameramen and an audio guy and a producer. And we went, you know, to Nashville to interview country western artists, and we went to Los Angeles to interview punk rock luminaries, and went all over and ended up doing hundreds of interviews. And here in Seattle, we recorded interviews with the members of Heart and Nirvana and Pearl Jam and a lot of the bands from the 60s, the garage rock bands like Paul Revere and the Raiders and the Kingsmen, 2 bands that were famous for their versions of Louie Louie.
Oh, right.
So I had a lot on my desk, and it was overwhelming in a fun way, and there was great stuff to do every day. And I worked there for 8.5 years, and working at a rock and roll and music museum was, just the funnest thing I ever did.
Yeah, that sounds like a dream come true.
Yeah,
I
it
mean,
was.
yeah. So what goes into building a collection like that? What is that process like?
Well, the process of establishing and building a collection for a museum could be an onerous, very difficult task. But again, I came to the table with all those years working at record stores, so I knew collectors.
Yeah.
One of the record stores I worked at, I was the mail order manager, and so I was mailing out Hendrix records to the top collectors in the world. And so I actually had a contact list of the top collectors. And so I basically transformed that into a process of recontacting them when I was with the museum and saying, hey, remember me from the record store? Now I'm with the museum. Did you ever want to, donate or sell parts of your collections to a museum? And because the museum was well financed by Paul Allen, one of the founders of Microsoft, we had a budget, and it was barely a budget. It was a little more than that. It was like close to being wide open, build a collection and do it now. And so that also spoke to these collectors, some of whom have been collecting, for example, Hendrix stuff for decades and decades and decades, and they had a house full of artifacts. And I think they were getting on in years, some of these guys going, wow, I'm in my 50s and I have 10,000 Hendrix related record albums or 7-inch 45 RPM singles or whatever, or 200 Hendrix posters. And I think some of these guys just went, this is an opportunity to see my collection go to a museum, make some money, and stop collecting.
Yeah.
Which is really hard for collectors, but I think at some point when you get an opportunity like that, it makes it easier for hardcore collectors to step away. And so that's what I did. I would contact those guys. And so that's one aspect, go to the top collectors and try and reel in their collections. The other thing, like for developing the history of the electric guitar exhibit, I made a list of what were the critical, essential electric guitars that came along in history. The first one that was electrified, the first one that had a tone knob and not just a volume knob, the first one that had 2 pickups, electronic pickups in it instead of 1, the first one that and then the first amplifier that had a bigger than a 5-inch speaker. And so we kind of went through the technological steps of how did they get guitars to be louder and louder and better and better.
Right.
And that's what I tracked there. I just tracked the technology, and I read all the books on the histories of guitars, made a shopping list, and went out and found them. And so my goal was to find, for every example of guitar that was noteworthy in history, I disciplined myself and I made sure that I found the first year of that guitar. So like if the Fender Stratocaster guitar came out in, I forget now when it did come out, 1955, I didn't go find a 1957 or 58. I've got the 1955. And so with every example of every model of guitar, I did that just to make sure that in the gallery at the museum, we could say this was what it looked like when it first came out and before it made its impact on the world.
Yeah. Any artifacts that were of note, either because they were incredibly hard to track down, or just like it was just this fascinating piece of history? Like,
Sure.
yeah,
Yeah,
do you
lots of
have any?
those.
Sure.
One of them, of the early electric guitar companies, people might know the name Gibson,
Hmm.
Gibson Guitars. As a company experimenting, trying to make an electric guitar, because they had been making acoustic, non-electric guitars since the 1880s, I think,
Mm.
1890s for sure. And but by the late 1920s, early 1930s, the first little electric guitar experiments were occurring out there, and Gibson said, we need to get in on this action too. It looks like these electric guitar things are going to be a thing, and so they started experimenting. And you can imagine a workshop with a bunch of engineers and carpenters, guys like that, guys who know how to work with wood and with metal, and a machine shop they probably had. But what they made to start their experiments with was called the mule, and it was a slab of wood on the workbench with some screws in it and some nails, and they'd stretch a string across it,
Uh-huh.
a guitar string or two or three, and then they played with what now can we insert under those strings that will pick up the electronic signals and make this an electric guitar. And of course, that little device ended up being called a pickup
Right.
because it was picking up the vibrations of the strings. But their first experiment may not have been so good, not so successful, and maybe the second or third, we don't know exactly how many, but they did all their experiments on that mule. And it's just a weird looking thing, but we reeled that in. We actually got
That's
that.
awesome.
So there's your beginning of the electric guitar from the Gibson company. That's one example of a
Wow.
unique and rare artifact.
Yeah. Wow. I would love to see that sometime. Do you know if it's on display right
I
now
don't
at
know if
the?
it is the exhibit that I curated back in at the grand opening of the museum, which was in 2000. That exhibit stayed up for a dozen years, and then I left. And in the years since I left, they rejiggered the exhibit a
Right.
few times, and I don't know if that particular one is on exhibit. It may or may not be. I haven't been there in a while.
Yeah.
But the other claim to fame that I have in the guitar world is that I discovered at least 3 different brands of electric guitars from the 1930s that were made and marketed out of Seattle or out of the Northwest
Oh,
that
wow.
had been long forgotten. Not a word had been written about them. But because I was always out there digging, asking questions and talking to elderly guitar players and things like that, I discovered a brand from Seattle called Audiovox Guitars, and that made guitars and amplifiers, and started publicizing. I ended up finding about 20 of those guitars over
Oh,
time
wow.
because nobody knew what they were, and they would show up at local used guitar stores, and nobody knew what they were, nobody wanted them. And I think I told that story in this book, Rock and Roll Archaeologist, about how those stores would call me and go, Pete, we got another one of these weird guitars in, you want to come and see it? And I said, I'll be right over. And so ended up finding a bunch of those guitars, and the guitar world, the world of guitar historians out there, basically have honored me by saying this is the guy who rediscovered these forgotten guitars. There was also a brand in town here in the Green Lake neighborhood of Seattle, the Hanbert guitars, that copied the Audiovox in the 1930s. And they
Yeah.
had a little legal tussle, those two companies, because the one copied the other.
Sure.
But those definitely nobody had ever heard of before, and I tracked that whole story down. And then the third one was Copic Guitars out of Leavenworth, Washington,
Oh, wow.
up in the Cascade Mountains. But in the 1930s, he was making electric guitars as well. And so, that's been a big thrill for me, is finding those and then documenting those stories and then publishing essays about them. I've had, cover stories in Vintage Guitar Magazine, and it's a weird little side
Yeah.
habit of mine, but I think the guitar history world out there has appreciated that I uncovered those stories.
Yeah, that's super cool. I mean, and then I guess going back to, the history of stuff, let's talk a little bit about Stomp and Shout, R&B. What does R&B represent in the canon, I guess I would say, of popular music of the 20th and then later 21st century?
Well, R&B, rhythm and blues.
Yeah.
Blues came first. They were recording blues, by the certainly by the 1920s, there may be a few earlier examples of that, and the earliest blues music, erupted in the South and kind of migrated north a little bit. Chicago became known
Hmm.
for electric blues, but the first blues was acoustic guitars down in the Mississippi Delta, and that was popular, especially in the black community, for decades. But by the time of the 40s and the 50s, and the Great Migration had happened with a lot of, tens of thousands of people leaving the South, going north and going west,
Hmm.
especially during the war years, World War II. It started feeling like a old form of music, and it
Mm.
was. And so some hip cats, mainly in the big cities, took the basic structure of blues, three chords, and and they kind of amped it up a little bit and put a little more rhythm behind it and made it easily more danceable and added, funkier bass lines,
Backbeat, that sort of
backbeat
thing.
on the drums, and by 1951, 52, the electric bass guitar
Hmm.
had, worked its way into music, and the rhythm and blues bands adopted the electric bass guitar before country music, for example.
Right.
And so rhythm and blues became a long-lasting, bit of creative American music, and it just kept evolving through the 50s and 60s, and by the late 60s into the 70s, it became known as funk, essentially,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
and on and on and on. R&B lives. The importance for R&B in the writings that I've done, the research and writings I've done, is that, um, well, in the book Stomp and Shout, a couple of the main points I try and make are that uh, here in the Northwest, the first generation of rock and rollers in the late 1950s did create a new sound. And it became known as the original Northwest Sound. And it was different than rock and roll in Southern California, surfer rock, that
Right.
sort of a thing. It was different than Memphis rock and roll, um, like Booker T and the MGs or the Marquis and things like that. There are regional sounds in America. There always has been. New
Right.
York doo-wop. But here in the Northwest, it was called the original Northwest Sound, and to my ears, when I started really studying it, trying to figure out, okay, what does make this different from other regional sounds, is that our rock and roll originally was largely instrumental, no vocals,
Huh.
and it was tinged by R&B. It wasn't just straight, again, like surfer rock or something like that.
Hmm.
It was always funky, and my conclusion was that the original rock and roll pioneers here had been influenced by earlier, older, black rhythm and blues and jazz players who were on the scene, because the Northwest had a strong jazz scene. And the punchline to all that is, all you have to do is listen to the original Northwest rock records, and there's hardly any guitar solos. They are
Mm.
saxophone driven and piano or organ driven, and that came from the influence of rhythm and blues and jazz.
Yeah.
There also was, for a while there, Northwest rockabilly that sounded like any other rockabilly. So, sounded like Elvis Presley's band or
Right.
Gene Vincent and the Blue Caps or Bill Haley and the Comets. Uh, the rockabilly guys, who mainly came from rural towns like Yakima, Richland, Chehalis, um, less so from Seattle,
Hmm.
they were influenced by country music. They were influenced by those rockabilly guys. But this Northwest sound was at the opposite end of the spectrum. It was concurrent, it was happening at the same time, but saxophone and piano driven. That's one of my main points in that whole book, Stomp and Shout.
Yeah. Could you just shout out a few artists to maybe check out that have that sound?
I can, and I will also mention that in conjunction with producing the book Stomp and Shout, we also made a Spotify
Oh,
playlist
awesome.
called Stomp and Shout. So if anyone wants to go to spotify.com and and uh, and listen to the Stomp and Shout playlist, I think there's a dozen key songs
Okay.
that are sort of the core of the story that I'm telling in that book, and you can hear them, and I think it'll make sense to people what I'm talking about now.
Yeah.
All those saxophones, all those keyboards,
Hmm.
and some of the bands of this time, of that era, that were critical to the formation of this Northwest sound were Little Bill and the Blue Notes,
Okay.
whose records either have 2 saxophones or 3 happening at the same time.
Huh.
The Wailers, who had a saxophone. The Frantics, who had a saxophone. These are the bands that had hits,
Gotcha.
not just records that got released and forgotten. These were the radio hits.
Mm.
The Continentals, the Dynamics, the Viceroys. Um, when I go do public appearances talking about my book, I like to point out what we're going to hear today, because I'll play samples of those songs,
Mhm.
and I'll say, you're not going to hear these song samples because they're my favorite bands necessarily. They're not my favorite songs necessarily. They are the songs that were the hits. They were chosen by the teenagers at the time who called the radio stations demanding that we want to hear these songs. So I didn't cherry pick the list. I didn't curate it so much.
Mhm.
I went by which songs went to number one on the Seattle radio market, which songs, and the pattern was, for all those bands I just mentioned, they basically had a local radio hit,
Mhm.
it became a regional radio hit, it became a West Coast hit, became a national hit, and in many of those cases they went international and were
Wow.
hit records in everywhere from South Africa to England, France, Germany, Argentina, Mexico, Canada. So in some ways, it is the greatest hits of the first phase of Northwest rock.
Yeah. We're talking about the first phase of Northwest rock.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit more about like the development of Northwest rock after that? You know, we obviously have like grunge is going to be like a huge not vantage point. What am I trying to say?
Reference point.
Yeah, reference point. There we
Yeah.
go. But, you know, there's decades in between that. So like what did the scene look like, you know, from the R&B to the original Northwest sound? You know, what's the missing links there?
Well, important infrastructure developed at the same time. So like when Ray Charles and Quincy Jones were in Seattle in the
Right.
late 1940s, the very earliest of the 50s, there were not professional recording studios. If they made a recording, they would go to a radio station downtown and sit at the radio station in the recording booth there, and that's how the first records were made. Recordings were made in that era. Ray Charles's first record that he ever recorded in his whole career was downtown at KOL Radio in 1948, 49. What changed then was that because hi-fi equipment kept getting better and better, and a few successful businessmen in town became audiophiles. They would build a recording studio in their basement so that they could just play around with some new gear, and at least 2 of those guys, 3 of them, I think, ended up being good engineers. And some of the records I just talked about, records by Little Bill and the Blue Notes, the Wailers, and the other one, the Fleetwoods out of Olympia, recorded international hits in the basement den of Joe Bull's studio in West Seattle. And so the other thing that's going on now is that radio stations didn't support local records at first. They were used to getting records sent in by the big corporations in Hollywood and in New York, but suddenly you had these local records becoming hits, and the radio stations wanted to get on board. So you have new technological means with good recording studios. You have the support of radio stations suddenly, and the teen dance scene was also picking up. It used to be in the old days that a high school or Catholic youth organization, something like that, they were holding teen dances that were sock hops. They were dancing, the kids were dancing to records in the gymnasium. There weren't live dances, but that changed around 1958. And they started, now there were new bands. There were teenage bands who could play the dances, so they started getting hired, and suddenly you had teenage dances. The next cool thing that happened was a couple smart businessmen went, well, that's fine that, you know, Roosevelt High School has a dance for their kids, and Lincoln High School has a dance for their students, and Garfield has a dance on Friday nights for their students. But the smart guy said, why don't we have an all-city dance downtown at the Eagles Hall or the Civic Center? And that blew things wide open. Suddenly any kid, any teenager from all over town and even outside of town could come. And then you had these huge dances with thousands of teenagers dancing, and that just really exploded the whole scene wide open.
Wow. That's really interesting, because I hear about the things like you know, Seattle started cracking down on that stuff, and that was the only thing I had heard. I wasn't aware that the dances could be that big. I just assumed like, oh, they're making it so that, you know, teens can't be at the show boxes as late. I didn't realize it was that big a deal.
Well,
That's wild.
it was decades earlier too. I mean,
Sure,
I'm
yeah.
talking, late 50s up into all the way through the 1960s.
Yeah.
And then, of course, in the late 60s, things changed. The music changed, the culture changed, and the hippie generation wasn't so much into dancing, and the band saw it, knew this. I've talked to enough musicians from back then that they were like, suddenly the audiences were sitting down on the ground watching the bands and twirling their love beads and lighting their incense or whatever they were doing.
Right.
It was the hippie generation, and it was not the frenetic, first generation of rock and roll kids. So things changed, and that kept evolving. And yes, you referenced the the dance bands. That was the 1980s when the city clamped
80s.
down, and they were trying to slow this whole thing down again.
Right.
It was a new phase of control over the kids. They didn't want them meeting by the hundreds or the thousands anymore. So
yeah, and they did a good job of that. Boy, did they. Well, it's been so great talking to you. I just have a few other questions right now. Are you is there anything you're listening to right now that you just kind of can't get enough of, or any weird musical rabbit holes you've been going into recently? Or
well, one thing I've noticed as the years go on, and I'm in my 60s now, is that I don't buy albums anymore, either streaming or CDs or vinyl albums.
Sure.
I only pick songs one at a time that I like now, and I stay current enough with the stuff I listen to, but one song at a time. And often anymore, my memory, I don't even think of who the artist is because I know nothing about him. I just know that song. I can remember the song more than the artist. So
Sure.
sorry to them. I apologize. But I probably can't even name them to you. But I pick them off the radio, I guess. Off of KNHC. I like the Nathan Hale High School station. They play, I like hip hop and electronica and that sort of stuff.
Yeah. It's an interesting time for music, I feel like, because I think there are you have like the really massive hits, but then there are so many smaller people, smaller acts that are doing interesting things, and it's just kind of a shame that now with with social media and TikTok and all of that, like, you can't just be a musician, right? You have to be your own publicist and marketer and all that. So it's harder for some of the little guys, it seems like, which is kind of a bummer. But where can people find your work? We've got the 2 books here, but I know that you contribute to History Link. Is there anywhere else that people can find your writing?
Well, History Link, I'm glad you mentioned it. History Link is the online free encyclopedia of Washington State history, and I'm a staff historian there. I've been writing for them since 2001, and I've published 200 some essays, many of them about local music history, but a wide variety of other topics as well. My main other thing I do is I'm the director of a historical preservation project called the Northwest Music Archives, and that is online. And I and my website partner and our team of volunteers have been working since 2013 to upload and present all the information we can find about every recording ever made in the Northwest.
Awesome.
So we started with the early stuff. I talked earlier about the early recordings here from the 1920s and the 1930s. That's where we started, because I love that almost lost history. And we have logged in information that the public can access, again, for free at Northwest Music Archives, about over 10,000 recording artists from the Northwest, probably half that many record companies that have either been launched out of the Northwest or have released records by Northwest artists. And so it's all about the artists, their recordings, and the labels. You can get the history of all these labels too, whether it's Sub Pop Records from the grunge era or Dolton Records, which was the first successful record company in 1959 and up through the early 60s. And that's been a real passion for me, is to document and be able to share that information, which otherwise may have gotten lost. But we've done really well by, in the late 70s when I started interviewing industry people here from the Northwest. So I went and found who owned those first record companies, and I interviewed them. Who were the radio DJs that played those early Northwest records? Who um, who founded the labels? Who owned the recording studios? And all that industry information. Who were the first early dance promoters? And I interviewed almost 500 people from the Northwest music industry, and that has been the basis of the core of information that I've been working with sharing with the public, and also with writing these books that I've done.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right. Yeah, I'll have to check all that stuff out.
Cool.
Pete, thank you so much for joining us. Before we go, the last thing I like to ask is there just anything else that you'd like to add that you want people to hear from this interview?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I will just tease a little bit and say that I have 3 more books in the pipeline.
Okay.
And then I promise I'm going to stop writing books. But I have 3 that I'm working on. The next one is coming out in about, 6 months, maybe late 2025. And it is a history of music making in the state of Oregon.
Oh, okay.
Which is an older story than the history of music in Washington.
Really?
Because, besides the Native American music, which I don't know much about and aren't featuring in the book because it's complicated, I've documented music making back to the 1840s when the
Wow.
people coming over on the Oregon Trail, and then also I actually before that, you had the fur traders coming through in the 1830s, and then the Oregon Trail people came through bringing their music with them. So it's a story of imported music, fur traders coming, sailors coming with their music, soldiers coming with their music, cowboys coming with their music, and then local people local people coming up with their own music and culture all the way up to current times. So it comes up to 2025. It's 1840s through 2025 is the breadth of that story.
Wow, fascinating. Well, yeah, I'll have to check that out as well. Thank
Cool.
you, Pete, again for joining us.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
All right. Rock and Roll Archaeologist is currently in process at the studios of the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library. It'll be in our catalog as an audiobook with the class ID DBC 31121. Stomp and Shout, R&B and the Origins of Northwest Rock and Roll is also in process here. That will be in our catalog as an audiobook with the class ID DBC 28293. We'll let you know in a later episode when these books are ready for download. If you have any questions or comments about the library, or to see if you qualify for our services, visit WTBBL.org or leave us a voicemail at 206-615-0400 or toll free at 800-542-0866. This episode of Literary Notes is a production of the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library based in Seattle, Washington. I'm your producer, Nathan Ureta. Thanks for listening.